Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday, the 26th of October. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 245 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I'll introduce this evening's guest, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Donetsk Oblast was hit hard in the past day, with at least 15 Russian strikes killing 7 civilians and injuring 3 more. The Ukrainian National Police said the strikes also destroyed 19 residential buildings and 1 power line. Russia has taken its allegations that Ukraine is preparing to use a dirty bomb on its own territory to the UN Security Council, an assertion dismissed by Western and Ukrainian officials as misinformation and a pretext for intensifying the war. Ukraine's foreign minister said inspectors from the UN nuclear watchdog would soon inspect 2 Ukrainian sites at Kyiv's request, adding that it feared Moscow's dirty bomb allegations were preparation for a false flag operation. Vladimir Putin said Russia needed to speed up decision-making in the military campaign in Ukraine. Moscow was generally supportive of the idea of creating a secure zone around the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, according to Mikhail Ulyanov, Russia's ambassador to the international institutions in Vienna. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky reiterated a pledge to retake the city of Kherson. Russia has notified the US of plans to carry out annual exercises of its nuclear forces, the US government said, adding that it lowered the risk of miscalculation at a time of reckless Russian nuclear rhetoric. Zelensky and the European hosts of a donor conference laid out a vision of a future Ukraine as a European Union member and a major exporter of green energy to the continent. The European Commission urged EU countries and companies to donate more money and equipment to support the energy sector in Ukraine, over a third of which has been destroyed by Russian missile and drone strikes. Ukraine's external financing needs will be around $3 billion a month through 2023 in a best-case scenario, but could rise as high as $5 billion, said the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. Poland's Prime Minister has said that Russian assets and those of Russian oligarchs amount to a huge pot of gold that should be used for Ukraine's reconstruction. And police have rescued an 8-year-old boy whose parents were killed in Russian shell strikes in Bakhmut, it was reported. Yulia Mendel, a former spokesperson for Volodymyr Zelensky, said the boy's mother was 7 months pregnant when she died in the street, along with the boy's father. Now, we are joined this evening by a regular friend to the programme. William Duguid is an activist, a commentator and a blogger, and he also helps to run the Perth and Kinross Yes Hub. William, good evening. How are you keeping?
I'm fine, thank you very much. Looking forward to tonight's bulletin.
Well, we're delighted to see you. Thank you for joining us on Scotland at 7 this evening, William. Our first story is that pledges to cut greenhouse gas emissions will lead to global heating of 2.5 degrees Celsius, a level that would condemn the world to catastrophic climate breakdown, according to the United Nations. Only a handful of countries have strengthened their commitments substantially in the last year, despite having promised to do so at the COP26 UN Climate Summit in Glasgow last November. Deeper cuts are needed to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, which would avoid the worst ravages of extreme weather. Simon Steele, the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, said, "This does not go far enough, fast enough. There is nowhere near the scale of reductions required to put us on track for 1.5 degrees C. National governments must set new goals now and implement them in the next 8 years." The plans for emissions cuts submitted in Glasgow were inadequate to meet the 1.5 degrees C goal, so they agreed a ratchet mechanism to toughen their targets year on year. However, few governments have updated their plans on emissions in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius. The UN's latest calculation finds that the plans submitted by governments would lead to a temperature rise of between 2.1 and 2.9 degrees Celsius, with the best estimate about 2.5 degrees Celsius. This represents a marginal improvement, said Steele, on the 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise that would have followed from the commitments made at Glasgow. He said greater action was needed from the private sector as well as governments. This is not just about words on paper, this is about getting stuff done, he said. The NDC synthesis report showed that current NDCs would lead to an increase in emissions of about 10.6% by 2030 compared with 2010 levels. This is an improvement over last year's assessment, which found countries were on a path to increase emissions by 13.7% by 2030 compared with 2010 levels. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has estimated that greenhouse gas emissions need to fall by about 45% by 2030 to give the world a chance of staying within 1.5 degrees C. So, William, as I've just said, the synthesis report shows that current NDCs would lead to an increase in emissions of about 10.6%, but the IPCC has estimated that greenhouse gas emissions need to fall by about 45% by 2030. A 10% increase versus the need for a 45% reduction. This will need a great deal more than just lip service and greenwashing to achieve, won't it?
I should think so. This is not the sort of thing you can do in a mad rush at the end of the period. We've got 8 years to do this. And we need to change the plans from the current ones to plans which will produce roughly half now, since we've gone up 10.6%, roughly half of emissions by 2030. I do not see how it's going to happen with the world as it currently is, set on a war in Ukraine, a dash for gas by the Western governments, bad international relations with the US and China not getting on with each other, and all the time, everything is an estimate. All the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have just been recorded at their highest level, particularly methane, but also carbon dioxide, which is really the one that needs bringing down. So it's going to be a difficult set of discussions, I suspect, at COP27 just next month when it meets in Egypt. And I think lip service is now out the window and we really need to do something.
Well, that's a very good point that you make, William. I was going to ask you about the prospects for the COP27 UN Climate Summit, which will be hosted by the Egyptian government and which will begin in Sharm el-Sheikh on the 6th of November, because the prospects for the summit are being viewed with increasing concern. Geopolitical tensions from the Ukraine war, the energy, food price and cost of living crises around the world, and the chill between US and China are all casting shadow over the talks, where the likelihood of major progress on emission cuts remains small. So why do you think is the destruction of life on this planet being pushed down the to-do list? Is it money? Is it domestic politics?
Well, who knows exactly, but I would say it's money. Sorting the climate crisis is going to take a lot of money. It's going to take the creation of a lot of money by governments throughout the world, because we can't do it on the backs of the population anymore. Basically, governments have got to spend to make all the changes that need to be made. And that will be uncomfortable for some of the vested interests that are out there. So I think that it's the vested interests that are leaning on the governments. And yes, it is about money. They were in denial for so long. Now they're in delay. Soon it'll be destruction, which will be the third D. So something needs to change in that area.
That's a very effective way of characterizing where we are at the moment, William. Thank you. As you say, denial, delay, and destruction. But let's look at the environment from another perspective now, because fracking will in effect remain banned in England under Rishi Sunak's government, his spokesperson confirmed today, saying the new Prime Minister was committed to the policy in the 2019 manifesto. The confirmation came after the Prime Minister told the House of Commons that he stands by the manifesto, which put a moratorium on shale gas extraction. The decision is another rebuff to policies launched under Liz Truss, as well as a full rewriting of her fiscal plans. Under Truss's very short-lived government, she lifted the moratorium amid significant divisions in the Tory parliamentary party. A significant number of MPs, including in the Cabinet, have spoken out against fracking, including the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, who said in June that it would create enormous disruption and environmental damage for little, if any, economic benefit. In Scotland, fracking has been banned by the Scottish Government, and despite Conservative Party calls to allow fracking in Scotland, the Scottish Government has said that onshore unconventional oil and gas recovery is incompatible with climate policy. Earlier this month, the Tory MP Laura Farris said that she does not wish to see fracking in her own community, but thought it would be appropriate in the northern reaches of Scotland. So, William, this is U-turn after a U-turn, which takes Westminster government policy back to where it was in 2019 in Boris Johnson's manifesto. So I was wondering, first of all, in terms of the politics, does this tell us that Sunak is in fact the continuity Johnson Prime Minister? After all, Sunak scrapped the £20 a week uplift to universal credit. He bragged about diverting levelling up funds from deprived areas to the wealthy Tory shires. He's found to have held a US green card while he was Chancellor, raising questions as to whether or not he was paying his taxes. He helped Johnson impose the hardest possible Brexit. He said it would be silly to deliver support for families struggling with rising energy costs. And of course, he rejected the calls to extend free school meals as families grappled with the economic crisis during COVID. So is Sunak, are the true colours of Rishi Sunak becoming clear? As I say, is he the continuity Johnson Prime Minister?
Well, it's politically expedient, I think, for him to be seen in certainly some areas to be going back to the 2019 manifesto, because one of the objections to the Truss government was that it was an unelected set of folks that were completely going against manifesto commitments. Now, I don't think for a moment that Sunak will stick to the entire 29 manifesto or go back to it, but this is certainly an easy win for him in that respect. So in terms of being continuity Johnson, we shall see. I would say, to set against all the things you said, he does have a nice smile when he's allowed to use it by his advisors. But so far, the jury is out.
Oh dear, yes, his smile. We'll say no more about that. I was wondering also in terms of the politics here. As you say, it's perhaps an easy win to be reversing policy on fracking. I wondered also about the political reality of it, whether he was taking this line now, because the very last time there was a vote on fracking, which was last week, it was so chaotic it collapsed the government the following day and cost Liz Truss her job.
Well, that was chaotic because, amazingly, Truss's government decided to call it the vote of confidence that wasn't. It was entirely of their making. That was a ridiculous thing to do. In fact, grotesque, bearing in mind that it is actually a climate-sensitive issue. But I think a lot of the Tory heartlands certainly do not like the idea of having fracking in their backyards. It's characteristic of them that people like Laura Farris might say, "Oh, let's just bung it up to Scotland." But the truth of the matter is, Jeremy Hunt, I don't think I'll often say this over the next little while, Jeremy Hunt is absolutely right. The benefits, if any, of fracking are likely to be minimal. The territory is likely to be unfrackable anyway. And the outcome in terms of the climate is just not sustainable. So I think it's absolutely, in this case, the right decision.
Thanks, William. And today, Lorna Slater of the Green Party in Scotland said that Rishi Sunak has a moral imperative to do the right thing. She said that his first 100 days of government, which will include COP27, must focus not on Tory infighting, but on the good of everyone. But surely, as we can see from the Tory government at the moment, everything in Westminster is about Tory infighting, isn't it? Every single thing.
No decision that Rishi Sunak and his closest colleagues are currently making is not thinking about what the rest of the party is up to. We're looking right now, we're seeing them look after the Conservative Party rather than the interests of the people of the four nations of the UK. No doubt about that at all.
Thanks, William. Now we'll look at another couple of Rishi Sunak's positions this evening. And firstly, the UK government is to re-examine the pensions triple lock and increasing benefits in line with inflation over the next fortnight, according to 10 Downing Street. Rishi Sunak has refused to make a commitment to the triple lock on raising pensions, a Conservative manifesto pledge, or to up rating benefits in line with inflation, which Mr Sunak committed to do when he was Chancellor. Liz Truss had previously committed to the triple lock, a guarantee that the state pension will rise every year by whichever is the highest of inflation, earnings growth, or 2.5%, after doubts were raised by Hunt about whether an inflation-linked rise would be possible. Sunak and Hunt have both stressed that difficult decisions will need to be made on spending, with departments facing potential double-digit spending cuts in order to show a path to reducing the £38 billion black hole in public finances caused by the recent market turmoil. The SNP Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Kirsty Blackman MP, said, having been parachuted into number 10 without a mandate, Rishi Sunak is wasting no time in ripping up his party's own manifesto and betraying millions of pensioners by refusing to commit to the triple lock on pensions or raising benefits in line with inflation. The new Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box earlier and pledged to stand by the Tory manifesto, and now it appears as though he's planning to ditch it, targeting pensioners and some of the most vulnerable in society and ushering in austerity 2.0. In 2014, she continued, pensioners in Scotland were told the only way they could protect their pensions was to vote no. 80 years on, and not only is every pension in the country under threat, but under Westminster, UK pensioners already receive one of the lowest pensions in all of North West Europe by comparison with the average wage. So, William, Ian Blackford in the House asked Rishi Sunak if he will reassure people and guarantee that benefits will rise in line with inflation. Sunak didn't answer the question directly, but says he always acted in a way to protect the most vulnerable, and he added that he would continue to act like that in the weeks ahead, but he didn't commit to the rise. So this is signposting. Is this signposting pretty clearly to us that it's the poorest who are going to pay, and it's the poorest who are going to be leaned on to try and fill the £38 billion black hole?
Well, we don't know for sure what will happen with pensions. They might still be thinking about it. As I said earlier, you get easy wins on sticking to the manifesto, but when it gets tough, like spending money, that might be a different kettle of fish. I think hard choices always seem to affect the poorest, don't they? Have you ever heard of a hard choice taken by a government that affects plutocrats? I think not. Dan Bloom of The Mirror, the political editor there, has called, if it happens, this a U-turn on a U-turn on a U-turn on a U-turn. I think there's a fifth U-turn as well in that sentence. It's chaos. The triple lock, I have to say, has been a bit of a strange mechanism in any case, because the one time it became inconvenient was when average wages went up quite fast after COVID. And of course, for that, it was suspended. So I'm not quite sure what sort of lock it is that gives way every time it's put under pressure. So I don't know what will happen in the end. I suspect that maybe Sunak will commit to it in the end, simply because there will be a considerable backlash if he doesn't. But wait and see, I think.
That's a very good point that you make, William. In a way, it operates the same as the government's energy price cap, which just keeps going up and up and up. And in the same way, as you say, the pension triple lock fails miserably to prevent pensions as when compared with incomes from going down and down and down. But I was wondering, in terms of, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment with regard to the delay in the budget that's been announced today. But less than a week ago, Liz Truss committed to increasing benefits in line with inflation. Now Sunak has refused to commit today. I wondered whether this might in fact be another example of continuity Johnson, insofar as it may be that Mr. Sunak is never making a decision until it's too late, and and in the same way as Johnson, never making a decision until it's too late and the decision is made for you.
Yes, that's possible. To be honest, in his initial press conferences or his initial addresses, if you like, he's looked very wooden to the point where you wonder if he isn't terrified by what faces him. And I'm not entirely sure that the cabinet that he's selected, drawn from all wings, including Suella Braverman back again, is necessarily the most comfortable set of people to be working with. It may be trying to appease all sides of the party. So maybe he sees continuity Johnson in a good way as maybe keeping the party behind him, but he's got a rough road to hoe there, I think.
He certainly does, William. Thank you. The performance of the new Prime Minister, in, as you say, in making his addresses, has been commented on by a number of people, and as has the description of the new cabinet as being the cabinet of all the talents. Really, rather tells us something, I think, about what's going to happen. But let's look a little bit more closely at the budget delay, because the Treasury has said it is delaying the announcement of the government's fiscal plans from the 31st of October to the 17th of November. It says the new date will now be a full autumn statement. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, said he had agreed to the change of date with Mr. Sunak, and that the statement would set out in detail plans to reduce debt and a medium-term plan to grow the economy. The new date means the economic plans and the OBR forecasts will not be made available before the next meeting of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, which sets interest rates on the 3rd of November. Mr. Hunt said that the change of plans had been discussed with the bank's governor, Andrew Bailey, and that he understands the reasons for doing that, and I'll continue to work very closely with him. It is the second time the date of the statement has been changed. It was originally announced by Kwasi Kwarteng for 23rd of November, but then brought forward under intense political and economic pressure to the 31st of October, in part in order to inform the MPC's meeting. Bailey had previously welcomed the move to make the fiscal statement before the possible rates rise decision, calling it the correct sequence. Commenting, the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, said, "This is an unwelcome and unnecessary delay by the UK government, which simply creates more economic uncertainty at a time when households, businesses and the wider economy all need as much certainty and stability as possible. It risks impacting on the timing of the Scottish Government's own budget plans, as we will now need to wait 2.5 weeks longer than previously proposed to see what the effect of UK tax and spending plans will be on devolved budgets. Above all, it is essential that the Chancellor heeds warnings not to impose renewed austerity, which would only worsen the extreme pressures already being faced by people and businesses as a result of inflation, rising interest rates and other economic factors." And the SNP Shadow Chancellor, Alison Thewlis MP, said, "This is grim news for households struggling to cope with the Tory-made cost of living crisis. We'll now need to wait longer to see whether or not desperately needed support is on the way. The Chancellor is causing more uncertainty with an unnecessary delay that will only stoke fear in families up and down the country." So William, John Swinney said that the delay risks impacting on the timing of the Scottish Government's own budget plans. At this rate, the Westminster budget will still be being set by the time the Scottish budget has to be fixed in next spring. How are devolved governments meant to cope with months and months and months of a Westminster government which is completely absent and does nothing but delay, delay and delay?
Well, they can't be expected to cope. They're doing the best they can, I suspect. It's a bind that they're in, because in difficult times you need to be able to have the flexibility to take decisions, and they don't in devolved governments have that flexibility. Difficult times hit the UK government, they can simply do something about it at the time. The devolved governments can't necessarily, so they absolutely have to have a certainty about what they can do. And similarly, the Bank of England is having to operate with one hand tied behind its back. And Jeremy Hunt can say that Andrew Bailey and his colleagues are they're working with them, and that's all fine. But I should think privately Bailey is fizzing, because I wonder what these OBR figures actually say. Is it possible that they're so bad that they're just the government is just trying to put off discussion of them for as long as possible until it all hits us in one go? Bearing in mind how the last few months have gone, you can't dismiss that possibility.
I think that's absolutely right, William. As I say, delay, delay, delay. One other little point with regard to this delay. 30-year gilt yields have gone back to their level before September's budget. Sure enough, markets seemed to accept news of the 2-week delay in the budget without even an inkling of the return to the chaos that dogged Truss's administration. And I was just wondering, might that be because the markets view former hedge fund manager and banker Rishi Sunak as one of their own?
Very possibly. That's another minority that Rishi's part of, that the hedge fund group. I mean, it could be argued that as a hedge fund manager operating in 2008, he's part of the architect of the initial banking crash from which we haven't fully recovered. So there's a circularity about it. It's fascinating. But I think, yes, there is a sort of one of usness in it, I suspect. I mean, the day that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak can be seen as safe pairs of hands, I thought I would never see. But here it is.
No, you make a couple of very good points there, William. In particular, as you say, Rishi Sunak was a partner in TCI, which was a hedge fund which put its sights onto ABN AMRO, the Dutch bank, which as a result of their investment activism, was bought by RBS under Fred Goodwin, and which, as you say, was very much emblematic of the financial crisis and cost UK taxpayers more than £45 billion bailing out the bank. So yes, there's a definite circularity there. But let's look at a little bit more of UK government policy from a different perspective now, because proposed UK government legislation to deal with the legacy of Northern Ireland's troubles risks widespread breaches of human rights law, a parliamentary committee has found. The Joint Committee on Human Rights found that the so-called Legacy Bill had the intention of addressing a complex situation with no easy solutions. But the committee urged the government to reconsider its approach and put forward a bill that would be compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. We are really worried that this is not compatible with the right to life, which is guaranteed by Article 2 of the European Convention, Chair of the committee, Joanna Cherry, KCMP, said. The Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Bill proposes an effective amnesty for those accused of killing or maiming people during the Civil War in Ireland. It is opposed by all parties in Northern Ireland, including the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin, who both say it will mean that victims' families will not get the justice they deserve. The bill was championed by Johnny Mercer, who is returning to government after being appointed to his former role of Veterans Minister by the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Meanwhile, the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, is holding last-ditch talks with Northern Ireland's party leaders to try and restore devolved government and avert an Assembly election. If the meetings in Belfast fail to reach a breakthrough by Thursday, which revives power sharing, Mr Heaton-Harris is expected to call an election, tipping Northern Ireland into further uncertainty. It is feared the talks may be doomed to failure due to the Democratic Unionist Party's vow to continue its boycott of the Stormont executive over the party's objections to the Northern Ireland Protocol. The impasse has increased the probability of an election in December, just 7 months after the last one. Sinn Féin overtook the DUP as the biggest party in the May election, a landmark result, but its deputy leader Michelle O'Neill did not become First Minister because of the DUP's boycott. So William, Joanna Cherry, KCMP, said, establishing a new framework for dealing with legacy of the Troubles is a complex and difficult task, but that's why it is all the more important that the government gets it right. Now, there's been no functioning government at Westminster since July, and no functioning assembly at Stormont since the 30th of May. Is it any wonder that the process of drafting sensitive and complex legislation is going adrift?
No, it's not, and it seems to be characteristic of successive Westminster governments or the vacuum that's existed in between, that things seem to get done in a very slapdash fashion and pushed through. I know we're at a relatively early stage, perhaps, of discussing this bill, but nevertheless, the fact that all parties in Northern Ireland are against this has got to be a sign that you're going down the wrong path. So it's a very uncertain situation, and I think we're beginning just to see the merest hints of the people of Northern Ireland and indeed Ireland taking matters into their own hands by thinking more in terms of a united Ireland. And I think we could go some distance towards that if things continue as they look like they're doing.
That's a very good point that you make, William. Thinking of the politics in Westminster a little further for a moment, we know that this week Dominic Raab is back at the English Ministry of Justice, and some would say astonishingly, Cruella Braverman is back at the Home Office. Both politicians are notoriously dismissive of human rights. I wonder sometimes whether that implies that they're not human themselves. But does their reappointment and their role in attacking human rights suggest that the Westminster Tory government doesn't really care at all about complying with the European Convention on Human Rights?
I think they would be quite happy to have a wedge to get rid of it. I think their idea of human rights might be very different from the initial authors of the European Convention on Human Rights, and indeed Winston Churchill, who was behind it. But overwhelmingly, it's just about keeping the party together. Braverman is in place because that's the wing of the party that has to be appeased. I have no idea why Raab's in place because I still haven't worked out what he's for. But nevertheless, he must have some set of supporters within the party that would like to see him there. Everything is secondary to this, it seems to me, including human rights. And that's not a healthy way to be proceeding.
That's a good point, William. Perhaps Mr. Raab represents the martial artists wing of the Conservative Party. Who's to tell? But let's look at European politics in a little bit more depth now, because the EU executive has proposed tighter controls on pollutants and chemicals that harm air quality and foul lakes, rivers and seas. But health campaigners say the plans lack urgency. As part of a major reform of the EU's anti-pollution legislation, the European Commission said it planned to tighten air quality standards, including one of the most dangerous pollutants, fine particulate matter. Water standards are also going to be stricter, with 25 substances added to a control list, such as the category of PFAs known as forever chemicals, the substance bisphenol A, pesticides including glyphosate, and antibiotics. Under the proposals, pharmaceutical and cosmetic companies would be required for the first time to pay the costs of cleaning their products out of the water supply. The EU's top official in charge of the European Green Deal, Frans Timmermans, told reporters, "Getting to climate neutrality is about more than pushing down greenhouse gas emissions. To have a zero-pollution environment in 2050, we need to step up action today." Day in and day out, we get new information about the degree to which public health is directly endangered by pollution. Babies now have microplastics in their blood, and there is PFAs in self-caught fish and homegrown vegetables. We pay for the pollution with taxes, health and human lives. We pay, and the longer we wait to reduce this pollution, the higher the costs to society, Timmermans said. The legal proposals will be negotiated and probably amended by EU environment ministers and MEPs before coming into force. So, William, water standards under these proposals, water standards in Europe within the EU would be stricter, with a list of chemicals, PFAs, bisphenol A, pesticides, and antibiotics banned. And under the proposals, pharmaceutical and cosmetic companies would be required to pay the cost of cleaning their products out of wastewater. This sounds like quite a significant divergence from the regulatory regime, particularly in England. Do you think is this the start of the divergence issue, as Westminster seems determined to pollute their green and pleasant land?
I think again there will be an increasing divergence, and of course every divergence that happens at Westminster lessens the chance, if it ever became politically possible, that it would be easy for them to get back into the EU and be part of the single market. So the gravitational pull generally is away from that sort of things. There is a big question about what the UK will do. English water of late has not been the healthiest place, as we all know. And certainly that would not be countenanced under the sort of EU regulatory regime that's being contemplated. Ironically, I think if there's an overall clean-up in standards in the EU, some of the UK will benefit simply because it's next door. Probably southeast and central England, which is a good thing because they could do with some of that. But yeah, I really don't know where regulation within the UK is going. And I'm not entirely convinced the government has made up its mind. It just wants to be different, which is not exactly the most mature way to be dealing with things when everything is such a problem.
Maturity is an interesting point now that the UK has the youngest Prime Minister in more than 200 years. So it's a good point that you make there, William. However, let's turn our attention now to matters in Iran. Iranian security forces have opened fire on protesters who had gathered in their thousands in Masa Amini's hometown to mark 40 days since her death, according to Hengaw, a Norway-based human rights group that monitors rights violation in Iran's Kurdish regions. Despite heightened security measures, columns of mourners had poured into Saqqez in the western Kurdistan province to pay tribute to Masa Amini at the grave at the end of the traditional mourning period. Ms. Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian of Kurdish origin, died on the 16th of September, 3 days after her arrest by the morality police while visiting Tehran with her younger brother. Local media later reported that Iran had blocked internet access in Saqqez for security reasons. Mourners headed to Masa Amini's gravesite this morning, even though the security services had warned her family not to hold the ceremony, threatening they should worry for their son's life, according to activists. Today marks 40 days since Masa Amini's death. Now, William, another human rights group operating and monitoring in Iran has said that 141 demonstrators were killed during the security forces' crackdown on the Amini protests, and they updated that death toll yesterday. Amnesty International said at least 23 children had been killed, whilst IHR on Tuesday put that number at 29. Now, that level of loss of life, especially young people, is that going to stiffen the resolve of the protesters, do you think?
May well do. This seems to be a fairly constant struggle going on. It's grown into a very significant revolt against the Iranian regime that has moved beyond simply the morality police and the death of Masa Amini. Where it will go, though, is difficult because the Iranian government has equally strong resolve and a track record of putting down revolts over the years and a brutal state apparatus that allows them to do so. So it's certainly one to watch. I mean, I remember being on Broadcasting Scotland when I think the first story about Masa Amini came up, and I did not realise at that time quite how significant this was going to become. And I don't, at the moment, see the end to it. There must be a resolution sooner or later, and I hope it isn't a crackdown. But I think if you're going to change a regime, you need more than people revolting. You need an infrastructure plan. And I think maybe they don't have that yet. And consequently, I think this either drags on or eventually it is put down. So we will just have to wait and see, I think.
Thanks, William. And that's an interesting point that you make with regard to regime change in Iran. In a video verified by Agence France Presse today, a group of people protesting chant, "This year is the year of blood. Sayyid Ali will be toppled," referring to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And of course, and today, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who knows a thing or two about Iran, speaking about the protesters, said they want freedom as they see through the eyes of the internet. Such protests are a serious threat to the Islamic Republic. It is a warning that this time you're dealing with a very different generation, a generation which knows about their rights. So, William, do you think as these protests this time are being led by a younger generation, and as Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe says, a generation which knows about its rights, do you think that makes the prospect of regime change more likely?
It depends how much support the government has got for repressing this set of revolts. The fact that it's being driven by young people may simply mean that they don't have experience of what it's like to be repressed quite to the extent that they're going to be. I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic about it, but Iran does have the power to do quite a lot yet in terms of putting this revolt down. However, the internet is an interesting thing in this area because, the internet being shut down as a matter of security shows how they see where the problem that they face, that's to say that where the authorities see the problem that they face actually lies. And it will be an interesting struggle just to see how much traction the folk who are putting out the protests can gain. A long way to go yet, I fear, but good luck to them, because I think something has to change in that country.
It's a number of very good points that you make there, William, and in particular, I think we should pay attention to see whether the deployment of the Starlink network of satellites which provide internet at ground level, which are being deployed in Ukraine at the moment, that whether they might begin to appear over countries such as Iran, which would take internet access completely away from the control of the government. But we'll continue to watch and continue to report on developments in Iran. But let's come home now, because work to procure 2 new ferries to help support island communities and improve the resilience of the Clyde and Hebrides network is underway. The Scottish Government has prioritised additional funding to enable Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited, CMAL, to accelerate plans for replacement vessels in the CalMac fleet. They will be built to the same specification as the existing ferries currently under construction for Islay. This will speed up the replacement of the major vessel fleet and provide a more standardised vessel type that can be used on a variety of different routes, providing potential economies of scale and enhanced public value. It's expected that the contract will be awarded before the end of the year, and the overall project cost is estimated at around £115 million, and that's including an allowance for minor port improvements. The Minister for Transport, Jenny Gilruth, said, "The Scottish Government is absolutely committed to improving the Lifeline ferry fleet and better meeting the need of island communities. So I'm pleased to announce additional funding to allow CMAL to launch a procurement for 2 additional vessels for the CalMac fleet." Excuse me. She continued, "Our intention is that these ferries would be deployed on the Skye Triangle routes to Lochmaddy and Tarbert, delivering dedicated services to communities in the peak season rather than the shared vessel operation currently in place. This will create the opportunity for significantly increased capacity and resilience for the communities of the Western Isles. It will also allow consideration of all options to deploy vessel 802 on an alternative route, including potentially alongside her sister ship, the MV Glensannox, to provide additional capacity to and from Arran in the peak season. All the options will be discussed with the island communities at the appropriate time." She continued, "Since this government was elected on May 2021, we have bought and deployed an additional vessel in the MV Loch Frisa in June, previously chartered the MV Arrow to provide additional capacity, made significant progress in the construction of vessels 801 and 802, commissioned 2 new vessels for Islay, and progressed investment to improve quayports and harbours. Now we are delivering a further 2 new vessels, as well as continuing to work on pursuing all reasonable and appropriate opportunities to enhance capacity and resilience in the short term through second-hand vessels." So, William, this additional investment will bring 2 new vessels to the fleet, meaning a total of 6 major vessels will be replaced by 2026. It also means that the communities in Harris and North Uist will benefit from a 2-vessel service, a move that will strengthen overall resilience. So 6 replacement vessels by 2026 sounds a bit like the Scottish Government is making up for long lost time at last.
I think so, and this is the real issue. The real issue with ferries is not the ones that are sitting in the yards being built and the cost escalating. That's something that will be fixed sooner or later. But the underlying thing is the reliability of the overall fleet and the capacity and especially the resilience of it. And that's what this latest move tackles. I think that it's hard enough running ferry services with all the problems you get with weather. So you need to be taking other resilience issues out of the game. And I think this goes a long way towards it. Also important that the island communities are being consulted, because that generally will lead to the best outcome. So I think it's a good news story. It's the sort you won't hear on the mainstream broadcasting channels because they'll be more interested in the headline stuff. But you can be sure that if there is any sort of issue with these vessels that are now being contemplated, it'll be instantly politicised. And I really wish I lived in a place where this did not happen. It doesn't happen in other countries. It needs to stop happening here. Sometimes you just need to give the government space to get on with things.
That's very sage advice there, William. And in terms of other aspects of the CalMac service, I was on the Finlagan last week, and I can confirm that the breakfast is as good as it always was. I didn't get to the CalMac and cheese, though. However, let's move on now, because a national public energy agency, Heat and Energy Efficiency Scotland, has been launched to scale up delivery of climate-friendly heating and improve energy efficiency across Scotland's homes and buildings. The initial focus of the virtual agency will be to build public understanding of the changes needed in how people heat and use energy in their properties, to act as a centre of expertise for green heat projects, and to coordinate the delivery of investment programmes. An independent strategic board has been established to support, advise and oversee the agency as it grows and develops. The Scottish Government has committed at least £1.8 billion to green heat and energy efficiency programmes over the course of this current Parliament, supporting a vision for more than 1 million homes and non-domestic buildings to be running on zero direct emissions heating systems by 2030. The agency, a programme for Government 2022-23 commitment, will oversee and coordinate support and funding programmes to help people, businesses and the public sector access the most appropriate advice, guidance and investment streams. A marketing campaign highlighting the Home Energy Scotland service will go live in November. The Net Zero and Energy Secretary Michael Matheson said, "Scotland's homes and buildings account for around a fifth of all of our emissions, and we need to take bold, urgent action to ensure we cut these emissions in line with our ambitious climate targets." So, William, focus on heat and energy efficiency sounds like a good thing during an energy price crisis and a climate emergency?
Yes, it's a small but welcome step. It's all of these things are always within the constraints that the Scottish Government have got, but this looks good. I think it will be important to have the marketing campaign, or at least the information campaign, for the public to see where this actually goes in practical terms for them, to what extent it involves the provision of heat, to what extent, I don't know if it covers insulation at all. That's another big issue that needs to be covered. But overall, I think there's a lot of work to do with Scotland's homes and buildings in terms of making them more efficient. And this just nudges us along that path, and that's a good thing.
Well, that's a point I was just about to touch on with you, William. The task here is immense, especially with the UK government pulling in all sorts of different directions, but certainly not in the same direction as the Scottish government. And we know that the challenges in Scotland are more significant and more severe than they are in the rest of the UK as a result of our environment and the weather, and our rural communities, which are not on the gas network. And which rely as a result on energy sources which in some respects are not capped at all. So to what extent is the Scottish Government likely to be successful when it's pulling in one direction and the UK government's policy is all over the floor and is pulling in different directions?
I think it can only be successful to a limited extent. There are things always that the government can do in advance of independence. But if you're looking at the really put together plans for what you might do in terms of climate change and fighting that, things like the Commonweal Common Home Plan, for example, whereas some of that can be done before independence, the majority of it, the really big investments, and there do need to be big investments, can only truly come after independence. So I applaud everything the Scottish Government does in the interim just to bring things along. But there is, as you say, an immense task, and it really does need the full powers of independence, I think, to tackle it properly.
Absolutely, William. The full powers, all of the economic levers and others that independence will bring to Scotland and the people of Scotland. Let's look at some other Scottish legislation which is being which is being consulted on at the moment, because tighter laws around grouse shooting in Scotland are being considered in an effort to protect wildlife and the environment. The new proposals published for consultation will form a new wildlife management grouse moor bill, which aims to ensure that grouse moors are managed in a sustainable manner. The consultation will seek views on a wide range of topics relating to wildlife, including introducing the licensing scheme for grouse shooting, increased regulation of moor burn, the burning of vegetation to maintain moorland, banning the use of glue traps, and increased regulation of other wildlife traps. The bill aims to implement the recommendations set out in the Werity Review, an independent report which called for widespread changes to grouse moor management and the use of traps in Scotland. The Environment Minister, Mary McCallan, said, "Over a number of years, the Scottish Government has introduced a wide range of measures to tackle wildlife crime, including a poisons amnesty, restrictions on general licences, and more recently, significant increases in penalties for wildlife crimes." Despite these measures, she continued, the persecution of raptors persists in Scotland. That is why we commissioned the independent Werity Review, and why we will now move to implement its recommendations in full. The Scottish Green Party have welcomed the proposed new measures to help tackle wildlife crime as an important first step to crack down on the persecution of birds and animals. So, William, this legislation has a long and tortuous history, which probably says something about who owns and who runs rural Scotland. It started with the Werity Review, which was commissioned on the back of a study by Scottish Natural Heritage, which found that 1/3 of satellite-tagged golden eagles in the Eastern Highlands had disappeared in suspicious circumstances on or near to driven grouse moors over a 12-year period. More recently, in March 2021, a golden eagle was found dead, poisoned, next to a mountain hare bait on a Deeside grouse moor in the Aberdeenshire part of the Cairngorm National Park. And this crime took place within 3 miles of where a young eagle was photographed caught in a trap in 2019, and a line of illegal traps targeting birds of prey was found set out across the hill in 2016. Meanwhile, satellite-tagged raptors continue to disappear almost exclusively on grouse moors. Perhaps the most depressing incident was that of a young white-tailed eagle whose tag was functioning normally until it suddenly vanished over a grouse moor in Nairnshire, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, the taxpayer had funded the programme to support that particular nest from which the young white-tailed eagle came. And despite that funding from that particular nest, 5 out of the 6 hatchlings have now disappeared. So it strikes me from that perspective that it's in the taxpayer's interest to regulate grouse moors.
Yes, it is, but it's in the general interest as well. This is, as you say, a big and a complex topic, and anything that happens now is just a first step in getting our own land properly under control and run in the interests of the people as a whole. It looks to me, looking at this consultation, that it would certainly please some of the folk in Commonweal, Perth and Kinross. When we were meeting by Zoom at the start of the year, we put together a letter which we sent to our local parliamentarians about just this sort of thing, about grouse moors, about land reform, and about, amongst other things, moor burn, which is tackled in this consultation. So I think I have to say we received a variety of responses and non-responses, but it's nice to see this now. I think it would satisfy some of the questions we had, albeit not all. But a consultation is only worthwhile if people join in with it. So it's important that when we get the chance to have a say on these things, we grab it with both hands. And if as many of us as possible can do that, then maybe we can just nudge things along a wee bit further than perhaps the legislators would otherwise have taken them.
That's a very good point that you make, William. You've made it on Broadcasting Scotland before. When there are consultations, the success of the consultation depends on people responding to the consultation and putting forward their perspectives. It's a very good point. And finally, in a broader sense, I was wondering whether you felt that there were perhaps indications of changing attitudes. A good friend of mine who's a very keen shot recently decided to shoot from now on only to shoot clay pigeons, and he told me that he was doing that on environmental grounds. Do you think that there is a change in attitudes amongst those who would be otherwise uh, 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 shooting on managed grouse moors in Scotland?
I don't mix with such people, so I can't tell you for sure. It would be nice if there were. Um, Surely attitudes can't be immutable. The planet is the planet. Watch it and react accordingly. But let's keep our fingers crossed, eh?
Absolutely. Thank you, William. I'm afraid that that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to develop the station and to make new programmes for you. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers, which would enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. But that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching, and I'd like to give very special thanks to our very special guest, William Duguid. Thanks, William.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure, William. On this day in 1911 saw the birth on the island of Raasay of Sorley MacLean. He would become one of the most important Scottish poets of the 20th century and is seen by many as the father of the Renaissance of the Gaelic language in Scotland. Time the deer is in the Halig wood. Please have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.